Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming today. We are thrilled to be back in the Toyota Auditorium after a bit of a hiatus. So we are running this in a hybrid mode, if you haven't figured that out. So we have folks in the auditorium, we have folks online, and like a hybrid class, we're probably going to have some bumps in the road as we go along. So bear with us, we're trying to figure it out. The first thing to note is that if you are viewing online, you can still ask questions to Dr. Gilligan. We'll handle those at the end, but please enter your questions into the link that you see on your screen right here, and we'll collate those at the end and feed those to Dr. Gilligan. So we want to make sure everybody that is virtually attending gets the full experience as much as we can. Folks, if you're in the room, we'll have a mic in the middle, and then you can step up to the mic and ask your question at the end as you normally would, okay? So welcome. If this is your first time joining us, this is the Energy and Environment Forum for the Baker Center. This is our opportunity to bring together different disciplinary perspectives on energy and environmental issues. We don't get to do that a lot when we're hanging out in our departments. We tend to talk to other people who think like us. So this is a chance for us to talk to other people and get new, fresh perspectives on things. It's been going on now for over 10 years, and so we're excited that it's still coming back into the Toyota Auditorium for another fall session. Let's see. Let me move through. So the schedule for events, there we go. The schedule of events for the fall semester. So we've got Jonathan today. On October 28th, we have Dr. Todd Schenk. He's coming from Virginia Tech. He will be here in person as well. So put that on your calendars. Todd's going to be, he's from Urban Affairs and Planning, and he will be talking about, or the title of his talk is Joint Fact-Finding Approaches to Bridge the Science Policy Interface as We Tackle Wicked Problems. So Todd's going to really be digging into questions about science and policy and how we convey that information and how it influences policy. On November 4th, we've got Matthew Burgess. Professor Burgess is from the University of Colorado at Boulder. He is in environmental studies and economics. He's going to be talking about the implications of slowing economic growth for climate change and society. And then on November 18th, our final forum meeting will be virtual, back to the original virtual sessions. And we have Dr. Megan Donahue from the University of Hawaii. And I don't have a title for her yet, but she is a ecologist, and so you can be expecting something in that realm. So if you would like to know more about these events and you're not getting emails, then email Elizabeth Woody at the email that you see on your screen there, and she can put you on a mailing list that you can make sure you get all the information. And then if you are interested in getting a recording, email her as well, and we can send you a recording. We have a new website that will eventually have all of these listed on it, but like everything else, it's taken a little longer to get up and running. So if you can't find it on our website, email Elizabeth and she can send you a link. Okay? So with that, I want to welcome our speaker for today. So Dr. Jonathan Gilligan is an associate professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences and associate professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Vanderbilt. He's director of Vanderbilt's Interdisciplinary Grand Challenge Initiative on Climate and Society. He received his PhD, or his PhD in physics from Yale and a minor in philosophy from Swarthmore. Dr. Gilligan has published one book and 97 scholarly articles and holds 2 patents, actually. His paper, Beyond Gridlock, won the 2017 Morrison Prize for the highest impact paper of the year on sustainability law and policy. And his book, Beyond Politics, The Private Governance Response to Climate Change, was recognized with a Vanderbilt Chancellor's Award for Research in 2018 and was named one of the most important books on environmental policy in the last 50 years by Environmental Forum. We don't have it in our library, but actually requested it, so it should be showing up soon. He is also, interestingly enough, the author of the play The Scarlet Letter, a feminist adaptation of Hawthorne, and the libretto for the opera Pearl. So join me in welcoming our speaker for today, Dr. Jonathan Gilligan.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's really wonderful to be here. It's Pleasure to be talking to all of you who are here in the room and the folks on the other end of the internet. I'm going to be talking about a deeply interdisciplinary project I've been working on in Bangladesh, looking at climate change, how it's affecting Bangladesh from a coupled natural and human systems approach. And this is a big international project. I can't name all the people on it, but here is a list of people who've contributed to this, both researchers in Bangladesh and researchers in the U.S., and we've been fortunate to have funding from NSF and the Office of Naval Research. So I'm going to start with pointing out, where is Bangladesh? It's in South Asia. It's between India and Myanmar, and it's right up at the top of the Bay of Bengal. And yeah, so it's up here at the top of the Bay of Bengal. It's interesting from a climate change perspective because it's in some ways the poster case for vulnerability. About half the country, a little less than half the country, is less than 5 meters above sea level. And so as sea level rise comes in, this is an exquisitely vulnerable country. It also is immensely densely populated. This is a map of population density. Bangladesh is the most densely populated country in the world outside of a few tiny city-states. To put this in perspective, Bangladesh has half the population of the United States in an area only slightly larger than the state of Louisiana, making do on an economy that's got roughly the gross domestic product of Arkansas. So imagine moving half of this country to Louisiana, and they've got to get along on the economic activity that's generated in Arkansas. That's what we're looking at. So this is why this is seen as a very critical case for climate change. If some part of the country is affected, there's going to be a lot of people there no matter where. And there's not a lot of empty space for anyone to move into. So the way that this story is told conventionally, this is from the third assessment report of the IPCC in 2001, says, here's Bangladesh today. This is a digital elevation map. There, at that point, was 112 million people. Now there's 160 million people. 1.5 meters of sea level rise on this digital elevation map would inundate 16% of the country and displace about 17 million people. A revision of this, published in the New York Times in 2014, says by that point there's so much more population, this would submerge 17% of the land, displace 18 million people over the next 40 years. So this is the perspective you're often told. Here's the land today. If we raise sea level, it's going to cover a lot of the land, displace almost 20 million people. But the real world is more complicated. This is a satellite photo of top of the Bay of Bengal, and what we're seeing is two of the world's largest rivers, the Ganges and Brahmaputra River, run into Bangladesh, and they flow together, and just after the confluence, they're joined by a third large river, the Meghna, and between them, these three river systems form one of the largest rivers in the world that discharge down here into the Bay of Bengal. And when you look at this, you can see that there's a huge amount of suspended sediment, silt and mud that's carried by these rivers. These rivers carry a total about 1 billion tons of sediment from the Himalayas down to the coast. And that sediment, a lot of it floating in the water, drifts over here on the currents and is worked by the tides up into all of these tidal channels that permeate the coastal region. That sediment is enough, if it were all distributed onto the land, to raise the land in Bangladesh by about 5 millimeters a year, which is more than the current rate of eustatic sea level rise. So when we look at the potential for sea level rise to flood Bangladesh, the landscape is not fixed. It's not like a bathtub that you fill with water. It's a dynamical landscape, and the transport of sediment changes the land in response to sea level. My colleague Steve Goodbread, who collaborated on this research, has been studying Bangladesh for almost 30 years, the whole geological history, and what he's found is throughout the Holocene, over the last several thousand years, as sea level has risen, the coastline of Bangladesh rose, so there was no shoreline retreat in any appreciable way. So there's a lot, we have to look at the complicated dynamical system here, and this is where human activity starts to interfere. Starting in the 1960s, in response to some catastrophic floods in 1956 and 57, the UN sent a bunch of engineers, mostly people from Northern Europe who were very familiar with the Netherlands, down to Bangladesh to help, at that point it was East Pakistan, to help with the flood problems. And they said, well, in the Netherlands, we're very successful with building what's called polders. We build embankments or dikes around low-lying areas to protect them from being inundated by water from the rivers or the sea. And so they built over 120 of these polders during the 60s and 70s, enclosing low-lying areas in ways that were intended to stop floods and protect the land. And there was a lot of good that came out of this. A lot of intertidal land got reclaimed and could be used for agriculture, but there are complications because all that sediment that I've been telling you about that floats in the water and eventually a lot of it deposits on the land builds up the land. When you build an embankment, same thing that we've seen in coastal Louisiana. When you interrupt this natural flooding, you interrupt the supply of sediment. No longer are you building the land up. Even worse, the sediment often falls into the rivers and raises the level of the river because the riverbed is rising. Inside the poldered area, the land dries out, the soil compacts, organic material that's in the soil oxidizes and disappears, and it sinks down. So what we see here on the top, an embankment where 50 years after the embankment was built, the high tide is a couple of meters above the land surface inside. The land inside has actually sunk down between 1 and 1.5 meters, and that subsidence caused by the embankment starving the land inside of sediment contributes 2 to 3 centimeters per year to the relative sea level rise. That's an order of magnitude bigger than eustatic sea level rise. And it means that just as we see in New Orleans, people inside the embankment are fine when everything's good, but if a storm comes and damages the embankment, they're at great risk for flooding. And another thing they find, New Orleans runs a lot of electric pumps that pump the rainwater out because the Mississippi River is about 8 feet higher than a lot of parts of New Orleans. Similarly here, if the inside is lower than the river, you can't drain rainwater, and they don't have electric pumps. So waterlogging, the accumulation of water, becomes a really big problem. Now, this should not have been such a surprise. The people coming down from Northern Europe, which is a very different environment, didn't know this. But local people in South Asia knew this. Back in the 20s and 30s, engineers, native Indian engineers, were trying to tell the British that embankments for flood control are likely to make the situation far worse in the long run. That there's a vast, intricate natural balance established among the various tributary streams of a river system. When man upsets this balance, he has to pay the price. And that's what we see. So my team, interviewing a farmer who was displaced by floods in 2011 from his home, said if the river could flow properly without all these embankments, then everything will be all right. So now I want to show you some of how this works on the ground. So we're going to zoom in. Here's all of Bangladesh, and I'm looking at Khulna district, essentially the equivalent of a state in the southwest. We're looking at Dakop Upazila, the equivalent of a county. So this is like a county. And then we're looking at, within Dakop Upazila, we're looking at an island called Polder 32. In 2009, a tropical cyclone called Isla came through this region and knocked down the embankments. This was almost identical to what happened in New Orleans with Katrina. The embankments were undermined, blown out, and so here on the left is this island in October 2008, 6 months before the storm came in, and here it is in November 2010, about a year and a half after the storm. And you see that it went from this very populated area to something where almost all of the island is underwater most of the day because of the tides and the embankments have been destroyed. They finally, in March of 2011, finished rebuilding the embankments and really got the water drained off. But this is a year and a half later. 40,000 people were displaced from their homes by the flood. And so we went in with a team of geologists and did a lot of surveys of the elevations. And what we found, let's see. One thing I want to point out, here's the island. This was all populated. The area to the west and to the north are populated, but to the south here, there's a lot of pristine mangrove forest that's been growing there for thousands of years and is mostly undisturbed. So this is mostly in its natural state here. So we could compare the developed area here to right across that little river, we have pristine wild forest. And so our surveys found that here is the level where the land was in 1960. As sea level rose, sediment was deposited on the floor of the forest and raised the land by about 0.8 meters, about 80 centimeters. On the river terrace outside of the embankment on the island, the sediment deposition had raised that similarly by about 80 centimeters. But inside the embankment, not only had the land not been raised by the deposition of more sediment, the compaction and the oxidation of organic material caused it to drop by about 1.5 meters. So now the inside of the island was a couple of meters below where high tide was outside. And that's why the island just completely flooded when the embankments were destroyed. But the other thing we found is doing stratigraphy. We found that in the couple of years when the embankments were not there, here's a nice horizon of sand that was carried in by the huge inflow of water on the day that the embankments were destroyed. After that, in the next 2 years, almost 0.5 meter of sediment was laid down, raising the land up, making up about 1/3 of all the elevation loss from the past 50 years was made up in about 2 years of regular flooding. And so what happens schematically, here's where we start out. The land inside is low down on this horizon, the dark. Here's the extra sediment that's built up outside the embankment. If you take the embankment out and allow flooding, that flooding carries sediment in. The sediment settles down, builds up height, and after a while you can build the embankment back up and the land inside will be almost as high as it would have been if the embankment had never been there. This is something that locally has been known and practiced at a local level called tidal river management, managing the rivers by allowing the tides to periodically, in a controlled way, flood over the land and bring sediment. And so we've developed a computer model of this process looking at the sediment transport, where we look at over here the rate of change of the land elevation, how much the land is growing or rising or sinking, is given by the sum of the deposition of sediment here, the deposition of organic matter that's mixed in with the sediment, and then is reduced by compaction. As the soil compacts, it sinks down, and then there's a little bit of tectonic subsidence. The tectonic plate is dropping by about 2 millimeters a year. And then we calculate the rate of sediment deposition according to things that we can measure. The settling velocity of sediment, which is based on the size of the particles of sediment suspended, the little mud particles or silt particles, the concentration of sediment in the water column, and then the dry bulk density, how dense it is when it settles down. We do this integral. This gives us the rate of increase of the sediment, and we add these terms up, and that tells us how the land will evolve. And we've calibrated this against measurements that we've made of the natural rise, the rate of sediment deposition and elevation increase on the natural mangrove forests. So here we are drawing on data from a couple of years of studying the daily tides, the sediment concentration, the size of the sediment particles, and we project over the next 30 years what will happen under 5 millimeters a year of sea level rise. This solid red line here is starting at the natural mangrove forest platform. Sea level's rising about 5 millimeters per year, and our calculation is at that rate of sea level rise, the land can just keep pace. It maintains equilibrium with sea level rise. Here we calculate what would happen if we start about a meter below the natural mangrove forest. This is sort of where the subsidence has lowered the land interior to the polder over 50 years. And we find that over about 14 years of flooding, it rises up to the level it would have been at if there had never been embankments. And after that, it continues to rise, maintaining equilibrium with sea level rise. So this points to the idea that controlled flooding of places that are below the water level could bring them back up, provide a powerful means of adapting to sea level rise and climate change. So that's the first part of what's wrong with that 2001 prediction that sea level rise is going to put all this land underwater and displace almost 20 million people. The land responds to sea level rise. It's not static. Now, here's the second piece. People are more complicated. There's a simplistic picture of environmental change and migration, that a natural disaster strikes and everybody leaves their homes, goes somewhere else. We create huge numbers of refugees after drought or floods or sea level rise. But migration is more complex. Historians tell us about 1,000 years or more of active migration all across the Bay of Bengal. And this follows economic opportunities. It follows social and family and personal connections. Environmental stresses play a role. Droughts, floods, cyclones play a role, but it's a complicated role. And migration can be both a sign of a system failure, where people can no longer live in the village they were born in and they have to leave, but it can also be a sign of strength or resilience, where people move out, go to a city, get a job in a factory, send money home, and that stabilizes the community. We find a lot of examples in Bangladesh of young women, instead of marrying in their teenage years and having kids very young, will move to a city, work in a factory, send money home. Those women have more political voice, more autonomy, and back at home, their family they came from, where they're sending remittances to, is better able to feed the kids, and you have lower childhood malnutrition. There can be a lot of benefits and strengths. We see here on the right from my field work in 2012, a bunch of men coming back from migrant agricultural labor. They went off to a place about 100 kilometers away from their home village for a season to work on a big rice farm. They're coming home. They've got their pay in rice. That's these bags of rice they're standing on. They're bringing back from one season of work enough rice to feed their family for a year. And so moving away from their community, where the flooding from the storm had made it impossible to grow enough rice, to somewhere else where they could get a job, grow rice, come back, bring back enough food to feed their family. This stabilizes the community. And so the historian Sunil Amrith, writing about migration in the Bay of Bengal, says that migrants did not react blindly to the furies of nature. What appears to be natural takes work. And another article by Lieberman and Buckley says, we urge greater attention to climate whilst avoiding climatic determinism. And that's the key. Climate change will have a very big impact on migration patterns, but it's complex. It's not a simple deterministic one. And for an example of this, from work done by Amrith and also by Mike Davis, we go back to 1876, when there was an intense El Nino that caused a 3-year drought and crop failure. This led to starvation. Between 6 and 10 million people died, and there was huge outmigration of people moving out of Bengal to Ceylon and Malaysia. But it's a complex problem because it wasn't just El Nino caused the drought caused the crop failure caused starvation, and everybody left. No. This was about the political economy of the British Raj. Because during this famine, the British actually increased grain exports from Bengal. You have millions of people starving to death, and the British are saying, let's send more grain out of the country because there is profit. Similar thing happened in another massive famine in 1770 that Adam Smith wrote about in The Wealth of Nations and talked about how it took the corruption of the British Empire to turn a dearth of grain into a catastrophe. 100 years later, the same kind of thing happened, and Karl Marx writes about it. It's one of the few places you're going to find that Karl Marx and Adam Smith see eye to eye and agree is how awful the British Empire and its colony of India was. So migration is complicated. It depends not just on what happens in nature, but what happens politically. So my research group is gathering data on migration and environmental change. This is a collaboration with two absolutely amazing colleagues I'm fortunate to work with, Professor Catherine Donato at Georgetown University, who's a sociologist and a demographer, and Professor Amanda Carrico, a social psychologist at the University of Colorado. And they've been leading, in collaboration with me, a Bangladesh Environment and Migration Survey, which has been doing household surveys of migration that retrospectively capture the whole migration history of everybody in the household. And our first phase of this captured almost 1,700 households. We now have more than 4,000 additional households from the second phase. And these surveys are very extensive. They capture as much as almost 2,000 variables from each household. And so we have now we have histories of migration from thousands of people that we're analyzing. And you can see over here the dots are showing the places where we've taken this survey all over southwestern Bangladesh. And so we start to see, in integrating this data and understanding it, there's different approaches we take depending on our research questions. Sometimes we have a clear theory-driven hypothesis of how the migration history connects to weather and changes in land and water and so forth. So one hypothesis, extreme weather affects marriage rates. We looked at marriage among girls, a lot of teenage girls and also young women. How do marriage patterns change in the year of and the year after a big drought or severe heat waves? And we found marriage rates increase. Young women and girls are more likely to marry rather than continuing their education or pursuing work. Not only that, they're more likely to marry men with lower economic prospects, less education, lower income. And they're more likely to marry men who express support for domestic violence. So what we see here on the right is the frequency of marriage to men who express support for domestic violence, and the duration of the heat wave during the year, we see an increase in marriage to potentially abusive partners as extreme heat waves become more intense. So this is a connection that we're now starting to see between climate change and behavior in ways that strongly affect women's rights. And we can use a conventional regression analysis to do that kind of thing because we have a theory we're trying to investigate. Sometimes, though, we don't have a theoretical framework, and when we have almost 2,000 variables to study, you can't just do a regression analysis if you're not testing a specific hypothesis. So we're now starting to work with machine learning and data science methods to do exploratory data analysis to try to find out what are salient variables that are important in connecting environmental stress to migration. We're in the process of working on these things. We're finding machine learning methods are showing a lot of promise in identifying salient variables, but migration is very complex and we're not thoroughly happy with our predictive skill. I'm not going to talk in detail about this today, but it gives some background to now what I am going to talk about around migration, which is how we take that data and rather than just doing statistical analyses to try to identify patterns, we start developing simulation models using what we call agent-based models that simulate individuals and households and their migration decisions to try to see what we can learn about the dynamics here. Very few agent-based models of migration use psychologically realistic models of decision-making. Mostly they use very simplistic things, and we're going to start with the simplistic models, and then we're in the process of developing more psychologically nuanced ones. What we know from the empirical research is that migration is driven largely by the ability to earn a living. Migration costs money. It costs actually quite a lot of money to leave a rural agricultural village and move to a city and develop a livelihood in the city, maybe as a rickshaw puller or a worker in a factory. So people who are truly destitute in the rural villages may want to move, but they can't afford it, so they're trapped in place. We find that social networks matter a lot. From our surveys, people who know people in their family or in their network of friends who have migrated are more likely to do it because that makes it safer and it makes it more reliable, that they know where to go, they know how to find a job, they've got a network they can rely on. And so migration depends on social networks and it depends on the ability to migrate. In our modeling, we follow a method that's called pattern-oriented modeling, where we look at empirically observed patterns in the system we're studying, and then we develop models that may compare different hypotheses about how the system works, and we compare the model's performance to the patterns that we see out in the world. So the target patterns we see here are drawn from work by Clark Gray and Valerie Mueller. Gray is at North Carolina State, and Mueller's now at Arizona State. They find in Bangladesh when a natural hazard strikes a community, if only a few households are affected, then migration actually drops. So you have a disaster that might cause a crop failure. And if that crop failures only affect a small fraction of the community, what you find is migration gets smaller after the disaster. But after some threshold, they found about 20% of the community is affected by the disaster. Above that threshold, migration rises as the disaster becomes worse. So that's an interesting pattern. Going from no disaster to small disasters to big ones, migration first goes down and then goes up. Second, people from households that are not affected by the disaster are more likely to migrate. People who are most affected won't have the money to be able to afford to migrate, but somebody who's not directly affected, if the disaster's small, they may not be affected. They don't want to move away. But if the disaster becomes large, it didn't affect them personally, but it affects the economy of their community. And now they've got the means to leave, and it may be more attractive to do so. So we're looking at, can our model reproduce these two observed patterns? So the structure is we simulate each individual in a community. Those individuals are members of households, and the households are members of the community. The household decides whether it's going to send a migrant to a city to find work. And so our initial model just follows expected economic utility. They take into account the cost of migration and the expected benefits that will follow later and say over a 5-year horizon, do they expect to be better off for migrating? The village economy has agricultural and non-agricultural livelihoods. Most people are farmers. Some do fishing. Some do collecting wood from the forest. Some run shops or other things. And there's an unequal distribution of land ownership. Affluent households hire laborers to work on their farms, and that's an important source of employment. And if a farming household loses its crops, it's not going to make any money off of its farms, so the people will go and seek paid employment on other farms. We run the model with sampling from a large distribution of possible values for the cost of migration, that's the y-axis here, and the utility to the household of migration in annual income, shown here. We vary the parameters. Each dot on the graph is a different model simulation with different values of the parameters. For each dot, we've done 20 simulation runs at those values of the parameters. And the green dots show simulations that matched the pattern in question. The orange show dots that did not match the pattern. And so pattern 1 is our pattern that for small sizes of the disaster, the migration goes down, and then for large disasters, it goes up. So for small impact, migration is actually less than when there was no disaster. For large impact, it's more. And so this is where we reproduce this, and then we used machine learning techniques, a technique called support vector machines, to try to find the ideal line that separates the region where you rarely match the observed patterns to the region where you frequently match the observed patterns. And what we find is for higher costs of migration, we do a better job of matching the patterns that are observed out in the world. For low costs of migration, we never match those patterns. We do the same thing for pattern 2. The people who are most likely to migrate are the ones who did not get personally affected by the disaster. And for that, the pattern is matched better by low costs of outmigration. It doesn't match well for high costs. So then we look at which simulations matched both patterns simultaneously, and we identified this little lens-shaped region of parameter space for which we get good reliable matching of both patterns simultaneously. So that helps us calibrate our model and show that under this hypothesis, there are values of the parameters for which we can robustly match these patterns that are observed out in the world. But now we go to look at another variable and its impact, which is the community has a lot of economic inequality. And in particular, from our surveys, we find that the distribution of land ownership very much follows a Pareto distribution, where a large amount of the land is concentrated in a few hands, and most households have little or no land. We can measure the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of the economic inequality. If it's 0, everybody has the same amount of wealth. If it's 1, all the wealth is owned by one person. So the higher the Gini coefficient, the greater the economic inequality. We observe from our surveys the Gini coefficient for the regions we're looking at are about 0.55. And for that, we run the simulation with a Pareto distribution of land ownership following a 0.55 Gini coefficient. And 80% of the time, the model matches both observed patterns. If we sharply reduce the Gini coefficient by more than half, only 40% of the time does the model match our patterns. And so here what we're seeing in the graphs is this is the fraction of the community affected by the disaster, from 0 to the empirically observed threshold of 0.2 up to the whole community. And vertically is the number of migrations going on. So the migrations drop at first, and then after 0.2, they start to rise. That's the pattern that's our pattern number 1. With a Gini coefficient of 0.25, we have very low numbers of migrations at first, and then they just rise after you get to larger fractions of the community affected. And for a Gini coefficient of 0.75, much bigger than we observe, we see the same basic pattern, and again, very robust matching of the pattern, of both patterns from the model with what we observe out in the world. And so this is pointing us to the idea that economic inequality in the village is a really important determinant of the patterns that we see, the dynamics of the relationship between disasters and migration. And in fact, if we use other distributions of land ownership that are more uniform or normal, we really do a bad job of reproducing the patterns. Having something like a Pareto distribution of land ownership that has a lot of inequality and calibrating that against the observed economic inequality becomes an important factor in understanding the relationship between natural disasters and migration. And so the pattern-oriented approach allows us to calibrate uncertain model parameters like the cost of migration. It allows us to start with a simple utility maximization approach to decision making, and we don't have results from this yet, but we're currently in the process of now running the model with more psychologically nuanced models of decision making, such as the theory of planned behavior and protection motivation theory. And this approach allows us to identify which parameters are most influential on migration patterns. So here we're finding the really big influence is in the inequality of land ownership and also the availability of jobs in the community. So that's starting to give us insight into the connection between disasters and migration. And now, for the final part of the talk, I'm going to go back to looking at where I started, with the use of controlled flooding in the polders as a tool for adapting to sea level rise, managing flood risk, and managing the problem of waterlogging, where the water won't drain from the soil after rain. There's been, starting before we went and started doing the research, local communities adopting this practice of controlled flooding. They call it tidal river management. And this is a region called Bilbina. It's up between Khulna and Jashore, inland about maybe about 100 kilometers from the coast, along a tidal river here that has still a significant amount of tidal flow in it. This is from 2001, a few years after they, you can see here water on the land, but you can see over here land starting to build up. In 2006, they cut some holes in the embankment over here along the Hori River and let water flow onto the land. Within a couple of years, the land right inside that hole in the embankment had risen by about 2 meters, and they're starting to have land now that's reliably above water. That's 2001. Here's 2010. All that land in Bilbina is now above water. They're not having flooding and waterlogging there. They started doing the same thing up north in a place called Bilkukshia, where again, they had just started this, and you can see here some land starting to form, but a lot of water up there. And here by 2013, Bilkukshia has also become very dry. Bilbina down here is completely dry. They've really solved their waterlogging problem. And so this was a real success. This was done in several places as a grassroots thing from the community. The government saw this and said, this looks great. They got a lot of money from the Asian Development Bank to go out and replicate this practice of controlled flooding. But what they missed was when this is done at a grassroots level, it's done by the community consulting with each other, coming to agreements about how to balance the costs and benefits, who gets hurt, who comes out ahead. The government came in and first started having engineers just do this without really talking to the community. And I was going up to Jashore in 2012, June of 2012, to interview somebody working at a NGO that was doing disaster relief. And I come up into Jashore, and there's heavily armed policemen everywhere, which is something that I'm just not used to seeing. Something unusual was happening. I asked around, and I found out that the day before, a member of parliament had been coming through to try to promote this controlled flooding project that they had going on, and it was so unpopular with the community he was talking to that protesters blocked the road by cutting down trees. They attacked his motorcade, burned 9 vehicles, and 50 protesters were injured in the melee that ensued. This is an example of trying to impose a policy. This is not a sign of a successful policy. This was really unpopular. And so why did this fail? The Asian Development Bank, in an evaluation, said the government did nothing to obtain buy-in from local communities. The government engineers had resistance to non-structural solutions, things that didn't involve engineering and infrastructure, but instead looked at the softer, more social side of things. They were resisting that. And there was a complete lack of understanding by the government engineers of an indigenous knowledge base, that people knew the rivers. They knew where the rivers would flow. They tried to tell the government engineers, you're putting the cut in the embankment at the wrong place. This isn't going to work because we know the river. All that was ignored. Or as a local farmer who I interviewed during my field work said, the government engineer would not accept our suggestion because he thought it was given by the non-experts. So here's the government's trying to force this process on people, and they don't want it, and they respond violently. But at the same time, a couple of years later, you got the opposite. Big flooding in another part of Bangladesh called Barishal, where about half of the cropland was underwater because they couldn't drain the monsoon rainwater out of it. And the farmers wanted to cut a gap in the embankment to let the water drain, and the government officials wouldn't let them. So here you have now the people want to do it, and the government's saying don't do it. The government wants to do it where the people don't want. This is not good policy. So we start applying agent-based modeling to trying to think, how would you come up with understanding some of the aspects of when people want to have a policy like this, when they don't, when it's going to work and when it won't, when it will create harmony and when it will create conflict. So we have a simple model of the coupled human-natural system. We have the model of sediment deposition that I showed you earlier. And then we have a representation of how standing water, whether it's from a flood or from waterlogging where the rain cannot drain out, will affect the rice harvest. Standing water, the higher the water is, the more it affects the rice harvest, and it can be, and if it's too high, you won't be able to grow any rice. The paddy farmers face waterlogging, and they decide whether to breach the polder and allow sediment in to build up the land so there will be less flooding and waterlogging. And then we add an agent-based model where we simulate farmers who are living on the polder. They have land holdings at different elevations, so different ones are affected. This is something I found from my fieldwork. I interview people, they say, oh yeah, the rich people live around the periphery. They're less affected by the waterlogging. The poorer people have their land in the middle where it's lower. They're more affected. So the poor people want to leave the gap in the embankment longer so that their land will get raised up. The rich people want to close the gap sooner. And so you have conflict between the more affluent and less affluent members of the community. And there's unequal land distribution. This really matters. So then in the model, farmers vote. This isn't actually done by a formal vote in the real world. It's done by more informal negotiations in the community. But for simulation, I'm going to take a vote. But I'm also going to give the opportunity, on the one hand, we can do a simulation with voting and majority rules, but we can also take a more economic approach, an approach similar to Calder-Hicks' approach, where we say, if the people who gain from a policy gain enough that they could pay the people who lose for their losses and still come out ahead. If I gain $10 and you lose $4, I could pay you $5. You come out $1 ahead, I'm still $5 ahead after paying you $5. So now we both win. Now we can both agree that this would be a good policy if I can compensate you from my gains for your losses. And then we look at the number of unhappy farmers. So this figure takes a little interpretation. Each row is a different year. So we start off here. Here's the elevation in our polder. The brown and the yellow are high elevation. The green and the blue are low elevation. This simulates a typical polder where the elevation's, it's shaped like a saucer, and the elevation's lowest in the middle and highest near the outside. This is, if you grow rice at this elevation, this is the profit. Yellow and orange are greater profit, blue is low profit. And so the people with land in the middle grow less rice, they make less profit. The people around the outside make more. If you cut a hole in the embankment on the left side, everything floods inside and nobody can grow rice for a year. But the next year, that's what's shown down here, after 1 year of controlled flooding, sediment has deposited. Most of the gain in land height is near where the hole in the embankment was, but everywhere gains. And so in the middle, instead of the dark blue, you're seeing a green. This has really gained a lot of elevation. And so if you grow rice under that, close the breach in the embankment up, grow rice, you get something like this. The people on the outside are doing a lot better, but the people in the middle, They've gone from something that's very low profit, they're now doing a lot better. But if instead of closing the embankment and growing rice like this, you leave it open, this is what the rice harvest would look like on the right. The people around the outside can grow rice and make a profit, but all the folks in the middle cannot. At the end of that second year of flooding, then, if you leave the gap open for 2 years instead of 1, you end up with this, a really big increase in the elevation in the middle. Look at this, much less inequality in how much rice people can grow. The people in the middle have gained a lot. They're much closer to being equal to people on the outside. And this, of course, would be if you kept the gap open and let it flood for a third year. But we're going to focus on, do you do this, keep growing like this, or do you take 1 year like this where nobody can grow, and then in all of the subsequent years you can have this where people are better off? Or do you let it go for this for 1 year, nobody can grow anything. A second year, people can grow around the outside but not in the middle. And then in the third year, you're like this, with much less inequality in the harvests between the people on the periphery and the people at the center. So we simulate this, we simulate voting and trading instead of the more informal decision procedures, but this is all based on interviews with people about how the negotiations are done and what the considerations are in community decision making there. And so the farmers' perceived value of the breaches to the embankment. Compared to no breaches, the blue are better off with 1 year of a breach and then close it up, the red are worse off. Here, the blue are better with 2 years than with nothing, and the red are worse off. And here, the blue are better with 3 years, and the red are worse off. You see that by 3 years, most people are worse off with 3 years than if you never breached the embankment. For the 2 years, you have a lot of people, the people worse off in the middle, are doing better with 2 years of a breach. So essentially, doing this. But you have significant opposition. So when we simulate the voting, most people want some number of years of a breach, but there's no agreement on how much. There's no majority for any one policy, and any policy you choose, most people will be dissatisfied with. But 1 year of breach and then close the embankment is the most popular. But if winners can compensate losers, so you have a redistribution, so people who are better off can compensate the people who are worse off, then there's a very strong convergence towards 1 year breach, many fewer unhappy farmers, much less strife. And indeed, what we found is in the, when this was done as a grassroots thing, one of the big things that made that successful, that was a failure when the government did it, was the community informally negotiated compensation to people who lost crops during the flooding and didn't get a consequent benefit after the floods were stopped. And so that informal, we're going to compensate you, we're going to make you whole, led to the community all being able to agree. When this came in, and some people won and some people lost, the people who lost were really seriously angry, and there was community strife and conflict. So to conclude, this is what we're finding. This doesn't mean this is how things are done, and it doesn't tell us how to do things in Bangladesh. It would be the height of arrogance for me to fly out from Tennessee to Bangladesh and after working there for 10 years say, I know how to run your country better than you do, because I don't. But it does give us insights into some of the dynamics of how different policies to address flooding and waterlogging can lead to conflict or harmony. So our ongoing and future work is we're working on improving our sediment model, and now we're looking at the implications. For India has a big river interlinking project where they're planning to divert water from a lot of the rivers away from the Ganges and Brahmaputra. This will reduce the sediment load, and that will potentially have really important implications for adaptation to sea level rise. We're working on our agent-based model of building more sophisticated decision dynamics that include psychologically realistic models of decisions and group dynamics rather than just individual decision dynamics. We're working on a more sophisticated treatment of the political economy that has more diversified livelihoods, and look at how the migration model interacts with the political decision-making model. And finally, as we are doing more years of the household surveys, we're getting more and better data. So with that, I'll finish, and I'll be really happy to take any questions. And I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to listen to me.
Okay, so folks, if you're online and you have a question and you haven't entered one already, jot this link down really quickly, and you can enter that, and we will field questions from you from online. And then, Jonathan, you can flip that back over whenever you'd like. But I had one question just to start things off. And I'm not sure that I'm reading the results right, but it looked like that what you were saying was that you had more migration with greater inequality.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is interesting, right? Because naturally I'm thinking of migration as being some sort of adaptive measure to climate change, and so then more inequality tends to increase a community's adaptive ability to respond to climate change. But I guess I'm thinking, and I'm also building on your point earlier, that a lot of these lower income individuals don't have the option to leave. So if you're thinking it's inequality and the low income folks are unable to leave,
Yes.
then it's mostly the people on the upper end of that distribution that are the ones that are actually leaving. So migration is really, it's adaptive, but it's the adaptation is unequal as well. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yeah, that's right. It's adaptive, but the adaptation is unequal as well. And the other question is, you think about it as a choice. So migration is one kind of adaptation. If you have less inequality, then you may have a community that provides other options for adaptation locally. And this is where a lot of people would, one big thing is a lot of people would prefer to stay in their home communities. They will leave when there's a combination of a pull factor, a great opportunity from elsewhere, and a push factor that's going to disrupt them, leave their family. Family is a really big deal, so leaving your family has a real cost to it. And so if you can adapt locally, a lot of people would prefer to adapt locally. And I have a good colleague, Bishojit Malik, he's a postdoc at Technical University of Dresden, and he's originally from Bangladesh. And he's really leading a new effort to call attention to what he calls environmental non-migration, of when people choose not to migrate in response to disasters. Different from people who are trapped in place because they can't afford to, but people who really want to stay in their home community if they can, and only leave if they can't adapt locally. And so what our model is suggesting is that when there's greater income equality or greater equality in land ownership, people may have more options locally to adapt by finding paid work where they might not be able to do that with the extreme inequality. So that's my interpretation, but these are new results, and there may be some other interpretations and other nuances to explore.
In presentation mode, so people online might not be able to see it. But if you're online now and you have a question, here's the link you can go to enter your questions, and we'll get those. So anyone in the room?
So thank you, Jonathan. I wanted to go to the first part of the talk.
Yes.
I have the figure with the projection for 2048 or 2050 of land deposition keeping pace with sea level rise.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously the figure can sort of boil down for us, but really you were talking to us there about the average, whereas flood control measures like your polder in part are about trading off variance events. And so I was thinking about sort of trading off smaller frequent flooding versus extreme flooding. So I'd love to hear a bit about
Yes.
how the variance, particularly the upper tail, plays out in that figure.
Yes, so this is really good because this ties into a really big challenge. Is generally what we find is the equilibrium we find in these places is that the equilibrium settles down where a place is inundated by the particularly high tide, so it becomes underwater by several centimeters fairly frequently, many times a month. And of course, you wouldn't want to live long-term like that. So this is a real challenge, is we can potentially bring the land up by having the flooding, but you don't want to have all the land flooded all the time. And so this gets into nuances about, can you do things like let a lot of the land flood while having the houses raised on plinths so people have somewhere dry to live while this is happening? Can you do this? There's a traditional practice that was done for hundreds of years before the engineers showed up, where people would build temporary embankments for 8 months of the year, and then they would take them down during the monsoon and let the monsoon rains flood and bring sediment on. And so that way they could have an embankment for much of the year, tear it down temporarily, because that's important, because a lot of these places, the river water is saline, and the flooding can really harm the agricultural productivity. In places where this is being done deliberately by a community, what they'll often do is turn to aquaculture during the times when things are flooded, so they can grow fish or shrimp while the land is flooded, and then return to growing things. And they can grow, there are some crops like sunflowers and watermelons that grow very well in saline soil that they can grow if the soil is then saline in the first years after they stop the flooding. But there's a lot of question about how you would manage this in the context of a specific community with specific river conditions, and how people are going to make a living during the time when things are flooded. And if you're talking about 14 years, you clearly can't tell a community, just let us flood your land for 14 years. Nobody will be there at the end of that if you don't have means of livelihood. One of the things we're investigating right now is a graduate student working with another colleague of mine, working with Professor Carol Wilson at Louisiana State, is studying the role of dredging spoils. So one of the consequences of having the polders is not only does the land inside subside, but the river tends to silt up outside, and so people are regularly dredging. And we're looking at, instead of controlled flooding, could we look at dredging the rivers and using the dredge spoils to build the land up so we wouldn't have to do the flooding? So that's some of where the this work is going, with trying to get at the local variations and the details of how are people going to live during this. I hope that's addressing what your question was.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Well, first of all, phenomenal talk. Thank you for sharing all that information. So I have two questions. The first question is climate change and global warming something that's widely accepted as a fact? And is there, I guess, a push from the government to educate the citizens, and do they openly talk about and discuss these these issues? And the second question is, if that is the case, is there a push from the government to seek help from researchers and especially international folks, or is that something where they kind of want to do their own thing and leave people out of their internal affairs, if that's the case? Thank you.
Those are two fabulous questions. If I could have paid you to ask me good questions, those would be them. So, okay, first of all, this is your question about, is climate change widely accepted? It's absolutely fascinating. Yes, pretty much everybody in Bangladesh accepts that climate change is real. Bangladesh is one of the nations in the world that is foremost in saying this is a big deal. They were one of the first nations to have an official funded government program for adapting to climate change. They have a really wonderful International Center for Climate Change and Development. They are run by Dr. Salim Al-Hook, who's a world-renowned expert on climate change and climate policy. And they're extremely active in leading developing nations in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change process to try to demand responsible actions from the developed countries and also to build up their own country's resilience. They're one of the leading countries for promoting solar power. They have over 3 million homes in Bangladesh that are in these rural areas that are powered by inexpensive, affordable, small solar systems, and they're installing about 30,000 home solar systems a month. They know the sea level rise problem, and they know how vulnerable they are, and they're very active in wanting to do things. Now, about the international community. One reason I love working in Bangladesh is there's a very strong sense of positive cooperation with international researchers, and there's a lot of opportunity in the course of the research to help not just kind of fly in and do research and fly out, but really help junior researchers in Bangladesh develop their careers as leading climate scientists. Because what we're looking to do in these projects is not just come in, do research and leave, but come in, work with our colleagues and our friends there to build capacity in Bangladesh. They host an international conference on climate change every January called the Gobeshona Conference. And this is bringing in researchers not just from the first world, but they're also bringing in a lot of African researchers. They support a lot of African graduate students and postdocs who come up and work in Bangladesh on looking internationally at climate change impacts and trying to develop how to make good connections between the climate science and policy. The ICAD, the International Center for Climate Change and Development, does a lot of also outreach. They meet with the government ministers. They talk with the press to try to make sure that the local press gets the stories out. And I've really benefited in my research from talking to reporters, environmental reporters at Bangladeshi newspapers who've been able to really help me figure out who I should talk to, give me the historical context of what I'm doing, and then it becomes a very good partnership because I can help out in the US and my colleagues in Europe in calling the world's attention to the really good research that's being done by researchers in Bangladesh. And so this is where I feel like there's some real positive things. Now back to the public awareness of climate change. This is really interesting. Pretty much everybody I talk to, academics, government ministers, but also people out in the rural communities know that climate change is real, but there's also a real awareness that climate change isn't the only environmental problem. And a lot of people outside of the capital who I talk to, educated people and farmers, will say, climate change is real, it's happening, but a lot of the problems we face are from government mismanagement, and the government loves to blame climate change for everything rather than acknowledging that it's playing a role with its own mismanagement of the environment. And that's a nuance that sometimes gets lost when we generalize too much. So that everybody knows about it, but there's a lot of resentment for the government blaming everything on climate change when people know very well that a lot of the problems are caused by government mismanagement instead.
I'm a bit short. So first of all, I apologize for the British Empire. We've
I don't think you single-handedly made that happen, and I imagine you may not have been there in 1770.
No, I wasn't, no. I did live in Bangladesh for 3 years, in Dhaka, and did not get to the Sundarbans, which is what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. But I did get into the villages somewhat, and they had built, the villages were up, mm-hmm. with their trees and their little huts in there, and then the beautiful fields full of floating lotus flowers were mm-hmm. just gorgeous. But when I left in 1980, they had a population of 90 million, which I thought yes. was pretty horrific. And I'm guessing that the lack of fields of land for the lower income people are because they would divide the plots between however many children they had, and they had children because that was their old age pension.
Yes.
So, a small plot would get divided 6 times, and then they would divide. So, yes. So, anyway, I'd love to talk to you afterwards.
I would really love to talk to you afterwards, and I can say a few things about some of what you're raising here, which is fascinating. Is yes, so they went from about 90 million to now they're 160 million. The rate of population growth, fortunately, is slowing, and one of the things that's really driving that is there's 2 pieces. One is growing economic agency by women. Women now have alternatives to getting married at 12 or 14, having their first child as a young teenager, which is really, truly horrific. And now young women are able to get educated, they're able to earn a living. This changes the way their family treats them. The family now sees the young woman instead of we're going to have to pay somebody to take her off our hands with a dowry. Instead, this woman is an economic asset to the family. Women can go into the cities, and this is the challenge. They work in these horrific sweatshop conditions, really unsafe labor, but it's still better than what a lot of their options would be back in the village. And now they have real economic agency and independence. They put off marriage, they put off the first child, and that helps their health and live longer. It also slows the population down. And as people are seeing that educating their children is really important, I was talking to a demographer from the U.S., from Centers for Disease Control, who was studying population in Bangladesh and was finding that the cost of educating a child is one of the things that gets people to shift their views of the old age pension from we need many children who will work on the farms to we need a few children who are well educated who will get jobs that are more remunerative, and they're more likely to live to adulthood now. And so we're seeing some real demographic changes driven by women's rights and economic opportunity for women being a very powerful thing. And so those are some of the transformations we're really seeing in Bangladesh. But another big piece has been the Green Revolution allowed them to dramatically increase rice harvests. So now you have more people are surviving and people are rethinking fertility because children are not so malnourished. They don't starve so much in childhood, and now people can be more confident that with fewer children, the children will live to adulthood. But a huge challenge is to feed this country in a transition to a more industrial economy. One of the big challenges is just they want to be self-sufficient in rice production, and so they're reluctant to turn over a lot of land to development for factories and industry if that means cutting down on the agricultural production. So there are a lot of really interesting conundrums going on. But there's a general, really large shift in urbanization, migration to cities, and towards an industrial economy. And I'd love to talk to you more afterwards.
It's also fascinating. And microloans, I remember, were very, the women who would get microloans, so they would get a cell phone and they,
Oh, yes.
The women were much better at paying back the loans, apparently.
Yes. But that is a challenge. I have a really good colleague I work with at Vanderbilt, Professor Brooke Ackerley, who's done a lot of research on, her specialization is on human rights and women's rights. And she studied the impact of the microloans, and it's sometimes helpful, but sometimes very punishing towards women, because sometimes the woman will take out the loan, her husband will take the loan, abscond, and leave the village, and she's left behind being held responsible for this.
That
and
doesn't
so
surprise me.
my colleague has had some very critical responses to, again, they're not all bad, but there's been, I think, maybe a rush to praise them and think that they're a little more perfect than they are.
Jonathan, we have several questions online, too.
Great.
So one of the questions that was brought up was, could you talk a little bit about the market structure for the farmers? Are there major corporations involved in this? Are they trading internationally? How are the prices determined? Something about that.
Okay, so yes, really good question. It's going to get me into a real can of worms here, but. So basically, the farms are the farms are just kind of held in the family, passed down in the family but there are some real complications. And this is almost all small holdings. However, early 1990s, when General Hossein Mohammed Ershad was the president, he was really pushing trying to get hard currency, so trying to develop exports. The rice is basically all, the agriculture is all consumed in the country, and I think there is to some extent a net importer of food because of the population density, but they're close to self-sufficient in food. But they certainly don't grow crops for export. However, what they do, in the 1990s, they started looking at aquaculture for export. So they have a big growth of shrimp aquaculture, where they're growing the Asian tiger shrimp, and then another thing that's kind of colloquially called lobster, which is it's a large freshwater shrimp. And so locally they're called Bagda and Golda. Bagda is the saltwater shrimp, the Asian tiger shrimp, and the Golda is the freshwater shrimp. These are kind of big shrimp. They're like this big. And so those are a big export market. They grow them, they freeze them, they ship them to Europe, less to the U.S. The U.S. mostly gets from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South America, but they export a lot to Europe. And that's their second biggest export product, is the shrimp. And this is an issue because it's kind of capital intensive to start shrimp production, and shrimp production is much less labor intensive. Rice production uses many, many times more laborers per hectare than shrimp growing. And so what you had was a lot of people with money would come in from outside the community and often expropriate land, not by buying it honestly, but by basically coercion, threats, violence, and fraud. They would expropriate land from local farmers, develop large establishments that then cut down the employment opportunities locally and also created huge environmental damages because the shrimp growing often has, it brings saline water onto the land, which often contaminates nearby agricultural fields and poisons livestock. So there's been a lot of real violence around the expropriation of land to convert from rice farming to shrimp farming. There are other places where the shrimp farming has been done in a locally managed way within the community that's more equitable, but it's the conversion from rice to shrimp with the big rise of the shrimp aquaculture that's led to the corporations coming in, and less kind of international corporations, more just kind of small things run by a local person, or not a local person, but a Bangladeshi person who has political connections to shield them from law enforcement and access to enough money. And they'll often bring in essentially people from outside the community, essentially muscle men who come in and will use violence to force their way. And that's been a big disruption. Shrimp farming was going to be their big export, but with the growth of the ready-made garments industry, that's completely eclipsed all the other export markets and has taken a lot of the economic energy away from the shrimp farming. But where you're just looking at the agricultural production, that's mostly done just as a very kind of small traditional village structure without a lot of outside interference.
Right, so another question, when embankments fail and the sediment comes in, do you see larger ecosystem effects from increased water turbidity and high volumes of sediment causing nutrient pollution?
Oh, that's a really good question. I haven't looked at that question. Certainly you get a lot of, you get huge amounts of nutrient use. You know, chemical fertilizers are super popular, and a lot of the agricultural extensions very strongly promote them. I haven't looked at those details in Bangladesh, but I've done some research in Sri Lanka where we found that essentially the government extensions and others were encouraging farmers to use way more fertilizers than were necessary, and this was leading to potentially really bad contamination of water. And in Sri Lanka, they have a lot of problems with chronic kidney disease of unknown origin that a lot of people suspect is connected to the overuse of fertilizer. Back to Bangladesh, we haven't seen exactly that happening, and I haven't directly studied the environmental impacts of nutrient pollution. As far as turbidity goes, all of these rivers are just completely turbid. They're carrying as much suspended sediment as they can, so they're very powerful, tidally driven rivers, very different from a traditional fluvial river. And the tide is bringing in a really big tidal lens that just that stirs up all the sediment. So the rivers are already as turbid as can be, and they always have been in the natural state. And so that's not so much of an issue. But I think other people are looking at issues around nutrient pollution, and I really don't know what's happening with that. I haven't seen any places, I've been there, where you have the kind of characteristic big algae blooms and things. And honestly, from my point of view, from what I do know, the much bigger sources of of problems with the river ecosystems are two big things. There's actually three things. So two of them, over-harvesting of marine life as part of the aquaculture. The shrimp farms I was talking about, they have to get shrimp fry from somewhere, and women will go out in the rivers with these big, very fine nets and just net everything they can, pull out the shrimp fry and sell those to the shrimp farmers. Bycatch from that is absolutely devastating. Overfishing in the rivers is really devastating. And so simply over-harvesting of aquatic life is one of the biggest threats to the ecosystems. The other thing is up along the Ganges and Brahmaputra River, industrial chemical production is huge. The ready-made garment industry, you have a lot of discharge of dyes and other chemicals untreated into the rivers. And then the third piece is the human part. About 95% of all the human waste in Bangladesh goes untreated into the rivers. And so you have one of your really big sources of nutrient pollution and also of disease has to do with the untreated sewage going into the rivers. Those are the things I know about. There may be, I wouldn't be at all surprised if there were additional problems from the nutrient pollution from agriculture, but I'm just not an expert. I'm not even familiar with what the research on that is saying.
So I've got another very general question that kind of takes us away from Bangladesh for a moment, but what have you learned to be important considerations to be successful in implementing useful agent-based models?
Oh, that's really good. I feel like I'm still working on it. A lot of what I would say is really important is I've been really inspired by a lot of the work that Volker Grimm has been doing on trying to establish solid methodologies for how you use agent-based models to do science as opposed to making them just be eye candy that provide attractive animations of your preconceptions. And so the pattern-based modeling approach, which Grimm and others really were advocating for about 10 years ago, I think have really transformed a lot of the ways we think about agent-based models and how you use them scientifically. Some of the other things I would say in practical terms for using agent-based models effectively is not everybody agrees with me. This is opinion. It's not stated fact, and it's not scientific consensus. I feel like too many models get too complex too fast. My students and I'm always pressing for, let's make this model as simple as possible. What are the fewest complications we can include and still produce something that's going to give us insight? I think we should not look for one model to answer all our research questions. A model should be designed to address a research question. If you make the model first and then ask what it's good for, you're not going to be as productive. And this is an insight I'm really indebted to Marco Jansen, who's one of the greatest agent-based modelers in the world, for just hammering home with me during a conversation, as he says, never start developing a model unless you have a very clear idea about what is the research question you're going to answer with the model. Make the model only as complicated as it needs to be to answer your research question, and make multiple specific purpose models rather than trying to make one general purpose model. So keep things simple. Models get too complicated. You have so many parameters that you can't figure out what any parameter does. That doesn't mean complicated models aren't useful. They can be. But I think you need a panoply of models spanning this scale from very simple to intermediate complexity to complex. And Stephen Schneider, who's another big intellectual influence on me, wrote a lot about climate modeling in the same way, that not all climate modeling should be done with big three-dimensional supercomputer general circulation models. You need Earth system models of intermediate complexity. You need simple one-dimensional models because each model is useful for answering different questions. And sometimes when your model is so complicated, you can't work out the causality. You don't know what thing caused the result. When you have a simpler model and you've thought carefully about what assumptions go into it, you can make a model where you know the causality, you know how changing this parameter changes the output in a robust way.
So I think we're going to let Jonathan off the hook here. Jonathan, this was great. Thank you very much. Folks in the room, thank you for coming out. It was great to have people back in the Toyota Auditorium. Your reward for coming out today is that there are plenty of cookies left in the back, so help yourself. Folks online, thank you for joining us. Let us know how this hybrid system worked out. This is our first time trying it out, so if there was something that went awry online that I had not seen, let us know how it worked, and we'll try to improve it and make it better for the next time around if there were any bumps in the road. But with that, join me in thanking Dr. Jonathan Gilligan one more time.
And I'd like to turn around and thank you all, because after a year and a half of only giving Zoom seminars, my goodness, it's nice to be in a room with people. So thank you so much for the opportunity to come out and talk to people I can see, as well as the invisible internet out there.